den Rechten.
Bir müşteri olan Camille, yani konumasta
Teil an der Nordseite.
şunu inceleyelim.
Moving forward.
So mobilities in India have a different tempo to the rest of the world. So for instance, on India's urban roads, there are taxis being pulled by people. They're called rickshawallas. These sit next to bullock carts carrying all sorts of goods. And in turn, these can often be found next to a brand new SUV carrying an IT worker. So all of these different types of mobility might be queuing together on a road because a couple of holy cows won't move off, that kind of thing. You see them all together. And this means that it's different to the rest of the world. So it has this idea of a different tempo. Outside of cities, in India's villages, mobility is also distinctly different. So there you can see plows being drawn by oxen, for example. And this is a technology that seems medieval to those in Europe or the US. As well, you see bicycles are ubiquitous, and many people simply walk for long distances to get to work or for everyday activities such as collecting water. Beyond these different types of mobility technology, there is also huge movements of people within India. So there's movements from the countryside to the city, from poor states to more wealthy ones. And this internal mobility is fueled by disparities in India's remarkable economic growth. For instance, India's hyped up IT sector only hires about 1 million people. That is 1/1000th of a billion. Many people move from the countryside to the city out of desperation and end up working in India's informal sector, which is actually 2/3 of its GDP. So as well on the move is India's small numbers of students. And this is a tiny number of people in relation to the overall population. But what's significant here is that you have all sorts of different levels of education. So on the one hand, you have vocational colleges, and on the other hand, you have these elite world-class institutions. And what combines the two is this access to global circuits. So you have these global movements of education, and there's an actual system to move people out of India and onto these global circuits to other countries. Now, in my research on India, I'm interested in the interweaving of these different types of mobility and the linkages between mobilities at the bottom of the social pyramid and those at the top of the pyramid as well. And what links up the mobilities at the BOP, which is the bottom of the pyramid, and the top, is a unique sense of austere innovation. And this involves doing more with less, resilience, robustness, and so on. In India, in 2005, you saw more than 267 million people living under $1 a day. And so this has transformed the idea of living within your means into a way of living meaningfully. So there is another side to this austere innovation. It tends to exacerbate the different dimensions of austerity between India and the rest of the world. So for an example of this, in 2012, India earned the dubious reputation of suffering the world's biggest blackout, with 600 million Indians affected. These kind of blackouts are regular disruptions in India, and many citizens resort to all sorts of innovative solutions, such as using their own backup energy supplies, solar panels, diesel generators, and these kind of things. But what needs to be stressed is this innovative austerity is not only a force for good, it can also has a role in the actual cause of the problem. So for example, innovation also exists in people stealing their neighbour's electricity, and that goes on all the way up the line. And so these blackouts actually occur because people have this austere innovation. The same thing goes for the huge number of mobile phone users. I mean, it's staggering how many are in India. You have more than 1 billion mobile phones now. This has been seen as a sign of a burgeoning middle class, but also it needs to be taken into account that mobile phones make a lot of sense to the wandering poor. So to give a constant flow of telecommunications to this vast number of mobile phones, you need a vast number of diesel generators because of the blackouts. And so what happens is you get these 2 billion litres of diesel a year being used to keep these phones online. And because of this infrastructure and the threat of blackouts, you see people innovating in kind of ways of using the phones themselves. So for example, instead of making calls, they receive calls and do missed calls. using free missed call features. And so they don't actually use their phones properly. So this is another example of this kind of austere innovation. Now, in my research, I've tried to focus on one particular example of this Indian innovation. And this is what's called a Juggernaut. And that's a vehicle that's been assembled by the rural poor in India from lots of other vehicles, usually motorbikes and kind of the back end of trucks. And these vehicles are often dangerously overloaded with people and goods. And they don't have the features of modern vehicles such as windscreens and seats, power steering and so on. Now, it's possible the Hindi word Juggernaut shares an etymology with the word Juggernaut, which we have in English. And the Juggernaut actually was a description of these huge temple carts, and they still have these in these kind of annual festivals to honor the god Juggernaut. And in the colonial times, these were seen as out of control ritual vehicles that represented Indians' lack of concern for personal safety. And so it was seen as almost a character flaw that they had this lack of personal safety. And so this austere innovation was actually seen as something that was negative within India. Now, these Juggernauts are very visible on the roads. They often break down and contribute to India's infrastructure problems. So they block highways, they cause collisions, they're unlit vehicles, these kind of things. And the owners, though, use the resources around them to repair the vehicles. So this is where you get this idea of resilient innovation at the bottom of India's social pyramid. Because these Juggernauts have no complex electronics or engine parts, they can be easily repaired without much cost. So the word Juggernaut has developed this idea of frugal innovation, but at the same time it's seen as something that's also negative, so it has connotations of corruption, risky behavior, and also cutting corners. Now, there's a really good image of this from 1979. There was a photograph which symbolizes this kind of innovation. It was taken of the Indian Space Research Organization's latest rocket. This was going to be one of India's first missiles launched from the country. And what you see is that as it comes out of the hangar, it's balancing on a bullock cart, so a cart pulled by cows. And at the time, this was seen as a modern spacefaring nation in India, but in fact, globally, it was seen as the government not getting serious about addressing endemic poverty and development. But for a spokesperson from the ISRO, they responded that this was actually an example of how innovative India was. So this bullock cart was actually much better, also this spokesperson reckoned, than an air-conditioned truck because it didn't interfere with the satellite antenna. It had no electronics. So you see this idea of Juggernaut as being favorable and negative. And what you're seeing in recent times is it being favored at the top of the pyramid. It's being also borrowed as a term for austerity. So, for example, you see in a recent book called Frugal Innovation, the CEO of Saatchi & Saatchi talks about austerity being a new operating system for the world, and Juggernaut in India as a practice that the wasteful West can learn. Now, many elites in India as well have adopted this term, and they're championing this idea of Indian innovation, drawing on the practices at the bottom of the pyramid. So it's an idea of a grassroots innovation that's portable to India's ICT sector and its phenomenal growth. And this is particularly seen in global outsourcing and other services where you see austerity playing a role in a global sense in terms of a knowledge economy. So it comes as no surprise that you see Nandan Nilekani, who's the co-founder of one of India's premier IT companies, Infosys, who featured prominently in Thomas Friedman's book, The World is Flat. He used the term Juggernaut in his book, Imagining India. And so it took kind of precedence there for India's elites. Many people are also skeptical. For example, Rajiv Mantri, executive director of Navam Capital, describes a Juggernaut myth, and others talk about it impinging on official accounts of systemic risk in India. So there's two sides to this idea of Juggernaut, but the most interesting one currently is this idea of connection between the top and the bottom. Now, one thing that's emerged out of this discussion about the bottom of the pyramid is this idea of using Juggernaut to understand the Indian consumer market. And you see globals like L'Oreal India's CEO Dinesh Dayal saying that there's this huge growth and desire to consume at the bottom of the pyramid in India's huge consumer cohorts, And by learning Jugaad, the companies can access these markets. Similarly, the managing director of Renault India, Sylvain Belaney, talks as well about these kind of local practices of self-construction and repair as a pragmatic ethic that businesses can co-opt and deploy in their activities in India to understand this kind of consumer base. So in my own research, I've been questioning this kind of borrowing by the top of these values at the bottom. And I argue that, in fact, Jugaad cannot be separated from its social and cultural context. So the practice is actually part and parcel of India's infrastructure deficit. And you have to take on board the dramatic social inequalities across different regions in the world and how Jugaad links to this. So I guess you could say there's a paradox at the heart of this idea of Jugaad, which is the word is contingent on India's unique risk society and works directly against the transfer to India of modern cosmopolitan standards of consumption. So therefore it's very unlikely that there'll be a mass shift, for example, to a middle class akin to the US and the UK through Jugaad. And what you see is then the paradox is two different versions of Jugaad. One from the top, which sees it as something that can deploy middle class values, and one at the bottom, which is actually highly risky and involves all sorts of kind of dangerous elements being introduced. So what you see is this idea of Jugaad as a draw card for India's elites, many of them who insulate themselves at the same time from India's risk society. So for example, you see them living mobile lives globally or living in gated communities as well in some of the IT hubs. And this points to a unique irony, which is in this innovative mobility at the bottom of India's social pyramid, which is at its heart, Jugaad as a mobility phenomenon actually obstructs the country's apparent development as a global superpower simply because it adds to the shortfalls in India's infrastructure.
Seite sowie den Außenbereich in Rechten.